There is a question many of you have carried for decades, even if you never put it into words. Why has everything always felt heavier, deeper, more intense for you than for others? Why did life never fully fit, even when you did everything right? If you were born between 1965 and 1985, this video is not a coincidence. Carl Jung observed that certain generations are born during moments of collective psychological transition, when an old way of living loses meaning, but the new one has not yet emerged. Those who arrive in such periods are not meant to adapt easily. They are meant to confront. Many in this generation spent the first half of life meeting expectations, only to awaken later with a quiet but unsettling realization. Success without meaning, stability without a sense of inner direction. Jung called this the call of the second half of life, the moment when the psyche demands something deeper than survival or approval. This is not a random crisis. It is the psyche asking for integration. And by the end of this video, you may finally understand why your life unfolded the way it did, and why its most important work begins now. When you were younger, you learned quickly that certain feelings were not supposed to be spoken. The sense that something fundamental was missing from the world around you. The quiet observation that adults seem to be performing roles rather than living from a place of truth. You saw it in their eyes during family gatherings, in the way they spoke about their jobs, in how they answered when you asked what made them truly happy. Jung understood that children born into transitional periods absorb the unspoken tensions of their time. Between 1965 and 1985, the world was caught between two opposing forces. The old structures promised security through conformity, while new possibilities whispered that life could mean something more. Your parents likely belonged to a generation that chose stability. They built careers, bought homes, followed the script they were given. And many of them were quietly unfulfilled, though they would never say it out loud. You felt this discord before you had words for it. It showed up as restlessness in school, even when you performed well. A sense of going through motions that everyone else seemed to accept without question. You might have been called sensitive, dramatic, too serious, or lost in your own world. What you were actually doing was refusing to pretend. On some level, your psyche would not allow you to fully buy into a system that felt hollow. This was not rebellion in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and more persistent. Jung described it as the voice of the self, the deeper aspect of the psyche that knows what is authentic and what is performance. For most people, this voice gets buried under years of adaptation. But for those born during threshold moments in history, the voice never fully goes silent. It becomes a constant undertone, a feeling that you are living slightly out of sync with everyone around you. As you moved into adolescence and young adulthood, you likely tried to fit in anyway. You pursued the goals that were supposed to matter: education, career, relationships, milestones. And on paper, many of you succeeded. But success did not bring the sense of arrival you expected. Instead, it often brought a deeper confusion. If you did everything right, why did it still feel like something essential was missing? Jung called this the problem of meaning. Modern life, he observed, had become efficient at helping people survive, but terrible at helping them feel alive. The generation before yours adapted to this by numbing the question. They stayed busy, focused on external achievements, avoided looking inward. But you could not do the same. Your psyche would not let you. Every time you tried to settle into comfort, something inside you stirred with discomfort. This is not a flaw. It is a signal. Jung believed that certain souls incarnate during specific periods because they carry the psychological material needed for the next phase of collective growth. You were not meant to feel at home in the world as it was. You were meant to feel the tension between what is and what could be. That tension is not a burden. It is the raw material of transformation. Many of you spent years thinking something was wrong with you. that you were too much, not enough, incapable of just being normal. The truth is far different. You were sensing a fracture in the collective psyche that others had learned to ignore. You were born into a world that was ending, even though no one around you was willing to admit it. And because you could feel it, you were unable to pretend otherwise. Jung often spoke about the phenomenon of the wounded healer, the one who must first experience their own fragmentation before they can assist others in becoming whole. This generation carries that archetype. The years you spent feeling like you did not belong were not wasted. They were preparation. You were learning at a soul level to recognize what is false, to feel the gap between appearance and essence, to sense when life is being lived from the surface rather than the depths. Now, decades later, the world is finally catching up to what you always felt. The structures that seem permanent are revealing themselves as temporary. The promises that your parents believed in are being questioned everywhere. And suddenly, your lifelong sense of not fitting in begins to make sense. You were not broken. You were early. You arrived before the shift. And you have been holding space for it ever since, whether you knew it or not. Understanding why you felt out of place is only the beginning. The deeper question is what that displacement was preparing you to do. Jung spent much of his later work exploring what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. Within it live not only universal symbols and archetypes, but also unresolved traumas that pass from one generation to the next until someone finally has the capacity to address them. Your generation inherited a specific wound, one that had been building for nearly a century before you arrived. It is the wound of separation. Separation from nature, from community, from inner life, from anything that cannot be measured or monetized. The generations that came before you lived through wars, economic collapse, and rapid technological change. Their survival depended on compartmentalization. They learned to split themselves into acceptable parts and hidden parts. They performed their roles and buried the rest. This strategy worked for a while. It allowed society to rebuild, to stabilize, to create the material comfort that many in the developed world now take for granted. But it came at a cost. The inner world was abandoned. Feeling became inconvenient. Depth became dangerous. And slowly, without anyone naming it, an entire culture began to live from a place of profound disconnection. You were born into the aftermath of that disconnection. It was everywhere, but invisible. It showed up in families that looked functional but felt empty, in careers that provided security but no sense of purpose, in relationships that followed all the right steps but lacked true intimacy. And because you were young, you assumed this was simply how life was. You did not yet have the language to say that something fundamental had been lost. Jung believed that every psychological split that goes unaddressed in one generation becomes the burden of the next. The parts of the psyche that your parents and grandparents had to repress did not disappear. They went underground into the collective shadow, and they waited. When you were born, you became the carriers of that shadow material, not because you did anything wrong, but because your psyche was open enough, sensitive enough to feel what others had learned to ignore. This is why so many of you experienced anxiety, depression, or a sense of existential emptiness, even when your external circumstances were stable. You were not sick. You were responding to something real. The culture around you was built on a foundation of denial, and your nervous system was picking up on the fracture. You were feeling the grief that no one else was willing to acknowledge. The loneliness that came from living in a world that prioritized function over connection. For years, you may have tried to fix this feeling by changing your external life. New job, new city, new relationship. And while these changes sometimes helped, they never fully resolved the deeper ache. That is because the wound you were sensing was not personal. It was collective. It belonged to the entire system you were born into, and no amount of individual success could heal a fracture that existed at the level of culture itself. Jung wrote extensively about the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. But he also recognized that individuation is not only personal. There are moments in history when entire groups of people must undergo a collective individuation. They must retrieve the parts of the psyche that were lost, face the shadows that were denied, and integrate what was split apart. This is the task that has fallen to your generation. You are being asked to heal a wound you did not create, to feel what others numbed, to question what others accepted, to reconnect what was severed. And the reason you are the ones being asked is because you are the first generation that has the inner and outer conditions to do it. You grew up with just enough material stability to have space for inner work, but not so much comfort that you could avoid the questions. You witnessed the collapse of old certainties in real time, which means you are not as attached to them as those who came before. Most importantly, you have lived long enough now to see the pattern. You have felt the emptiness of a life built only on external achievement. You have experienced the cost of disconnection firsthand, and many of you have already begun, consciously or unconsciously, to turn inward, to ask what truly matters, to seek something more authentic than what you were given. This is not self-improvement. This is soul retrieval. You are being called to go back and gather the parts of the human experience that were abandoned in the rush toward progress. The grief, the slowness, the mystery, the connection to something larger than the individual self. These are not luxuries. They are necessities. And without them, the culture you inherited will continue to fracture until it can no longer hold. Jung believed that the psyche always moves toward wholeness, even when it has to create a crisis to get there. Your generation is that crisis. You are the ones who could not pretend, could not numb, could not continue the pattern of disconnection. And now, whether you are ready or not, you are being asked to do the work of reconnection, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who comes after. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. The burden of carrying collective shadow material would be unbearable if it came without corresponding strengths. Jung understood this deeply. He observed that those who are asked to do the hardest psychological work are also given specific capacities that make that work possible. Your generation was not sent into this transition empty-handed. You carry 3 distinct gifts that previous generations did not have in the same combination, and these gifts are precisely what is needed for the task ahead. The first is the ability to hold paradox. You grew up in a time when old and new existed side by side without resolution. You watched analog become digital. You saw the promise of progress alongside its consequences. You experienced both the security of traditional structures and their obvious limitations. This created a kind of psychological flexibility that earlier generations did not develop. You learned, often without realizing it, that 2 opposing truths can exist at the same time. This might not sound like much, but it is essential. The work of integration requires the capacity to hold tension without collapsing into one side or the other. To acknowledge that your parents did their best, and that their best was not enough. That the systems you were raised in provided stability and also caused harm. That you can honor what was while still choosing something different. Many people cannot do this. They need to make one side right and the other wrong. But you have lived in the space between for so long that you have developed a tolerance for ambiguity that is rare and necessary. The second gift is a deep distrust of authority without cynicism. You came of age during a time when institutions were still powerful but beginning to show cracks. You were taught to respect systems, and then you watched those systems fail people repeatedly. Governments, religions, corporations, even family structures revealed themselves to be far more fragile and flawed than anyone wanted to admit. This could have made you bitter. For some, it did, but for many, it created something else. A healthy skepticism, a refusal to blindly follow, but also a recognition that leadership and guidance still matter. You do not want to tear everything down. You want to build something that actually works. This is critical because the task ahead is not destruction. It is transformation, and transformation requires discernment. You must be able to see what is worth keeping and what needs to be released. You must be able to question inherited beliefs without losing your connection to wisdom itself. This balance is delicate, and your generation has been walking it for decades without necessarily naming it. You know that the old ways are insufficient, but you also know that rejecting everything that came before is not the answer. You are looking for what is true, not what is popular or convenient. The third gift is perhaps the most uncomfortable. It is the experience of existential loneliness. Not the loneliness that comes from lack of social connection, though many of you have felt that too. This is a deeper kind, the sense of being fundamentally alone in your awareness, of seeing things that others do not see, of feeling things that others have learned not to feel, of knowing on some level that you are walking a path that cannot be fully shared or understood by those around you. Jung called this the loneliness of individuation. It is the natural result of becoming conscious in a world that mostly runs on unconsciousness. And while it is painful, it is also a sign that you are doing the work. The loneliness you feel is not evidence that you are broken or disconnected. It is evidence that you are awake, that you have not chosen the comfort of collective sleep, that you are willing to stand in your own experience even when it separates you from the crowd. This capacity for aloneness is what will allow you to make choices that others cannot make, to say no to systems that do not serve life, even when everyone else is saying yes, to trust your inner knowing even when it contradicts external validation, to walk away from what looks successful but feels dead. These are not easy choices, and they often come with real consequences. But you can make them because you have already lived through the worst of what loneliness feels like. You are not afraid of it anymore. You know it does not kill you, and that knowing is a kind of freedom. Together, these three capacities create a foundation for the work you are here to do. The ability to hold paradox allows you to integrate what was split. The healthy distrust of authority gives you the discernment to know what is worth keeping. And the comfort with existential loneliness provides the inner strength to walk your own path, even when it is unpopular or misunderstood. These are not weaknesses. They are not burdens. They are tools. And you have spent your entire life learning how to use them, whether you realized it or not. Having the tools is one thing. Knowing when to use them is another. Jung was clear that timing matters in psychological work. There are moments when the psyche is ripe for transformation and moments when it is not. Push too early and resistance hardens. Wait too long and the opportunity passes. Your generation has reached the moment when everything you have been carrying, all the preparation you did not know you were doing, comes into focus. This decade is not like the others. It is a threshold. You are now in your late 30s, 40s, and early 50s. Jung identified this period as the most critical phase of psychological development. The first half of life, he said, is about building an identity in the world. You learn the rules, develop skills, establish yourself. But somewhere around the midpoint, a shift happens. The questions change. What once felt important starts to feel hollow. Success stops being enough, and the psyche begins to demand something it was willing to wait for earlier. meaning, authenticity, a life that feels true from the inside, not just acceptable from the outside. This is not a crisis in the negative sense, though it often gets labeled that way. It is a call. The second half of life is when the deeper work begins. When you stop performing for others and start living for something more essential. But here is what makes your situation different from previous generations. You are hitting this natural psychological turning point at the exact same moment that the collective structures around you are also reaching a breaking point. The timing is not coincidental, it is synchronistic. The world you were born into is ending, not in a dramatic apocalyptic sense, but in a slow unraveling that anyone paying attention can see. Economic systems that promise security are failing. Environmental stability that was taken for granted is disappearing. Social contracts that held communities together are fraying. The institutions that your parents trusted are losing legitimacy, and the belief that progress is inevitable, that things will always get better, is being quietly abandoned by more and more people. This is terrifying for those who built their lives on the assumption of continuity. But for you, it is clarifying. You always knew something was wrong. You always felt the instability underneath the surface. And now, as the masks come off and the illusions fade, you are not as shocked as others. You are in a strange way prepared, not because you wanted this, but because your psyche has been rehearsing for it your entire life. Jung taught that the greatest transformations happen when inner readiness meets outer necessity. You cannot force someone to change before they are ready, and you cannot expect change to happen without pressure. Right now, both conditions are present. Internally, you have reached the age where your psyche is demanding depth and meaning. Externally, the world is demanding that you make choices you could avoid before. Do you continue playing along with systems you know are broken, or do you begin to live differently? Do you prioritize comfort and security, or do you prioritize truth and integrity? These are not abstract questions anymore. They are becoming daily decisions. The danger of this moment is paralysis. Many in your generation feel the weight of what is being asked and freeze. The task seems too big. The odds seem too long, and the safer choice is to retreat into distraction, to stay busy, to focus on personal survival and ignore the larger picture. This is understandable, but it is also exactly what cannot happen. Because if you, the generation that was prepared for this, choose to look away, then who will do the work? Who will hold the tension? Who will model what it looks like to live with integrity in a time of collapse? The other danger is urgency without grounding. Some will feel the pressure of the moment and rush into action without doing the inner work first. They will try to fix the external world before they have faced their own shadows. They will project their unresolved material onto others and call it activism. Jung was clear about this trap. Outer change without inner change is not transformation. It is just rearranging the same patterns in new forms. The work must begin inside, with your own healing, your own integration, your own willingness to face what you have been avoiding. This decade is asking you to make a choice that will define the rest of your life. Not a career choice or a relationship choice, though those may be part of it. A deeper choice. Whether you will continue to adapt to a world that is dying, or whether you will begin to embody something new. Whether you will spend your remaining years trying to hold together what is falling apart, or whether you will invest your energy in what is trying to emerge. This is not about optimism or pessimism. It is about direction. Where you place your attention, your creativity, your life force. Jung believed that every individual who does their own inner work contributes to the healing of the collective. You do not have to save the world. You do not have to have all the answers. You simply have to stop betraying yourself. Stop pretending you do not see what you see. Stop numbing what you feel. Stop living in ways that contradict what you know to be true. That alone is enough. Because when you stop participating in the lie, you create space for something real. And that space, multiplied across thousands of people making the same choice, becomes the foundation for whatever comes next. Before this moment of decision, there were years of preparation you did not recognize. Your psyche has been sending signals for a long time, trying to get your attention, trying to redirect you toward what is real. But the signals were often uncomfortable, so you learned to ignore them. You explained them away. You told yourself they did not mean anything. You kept moving forward as if nothing was calling you to stop and reconsider. Jung called these signals the voice of the self. It speaks through symptoms, through dreams, through sudden losses and unexpected disruptions. It does not use logic or linear communication. It speaks in the language of the body, of emotion, of synchronicity. And most people are not trained to listen. They are trained to override, to push through, to keep going even when everything inside them is asking them to pause. For many in your generation, the first signal came as restlessness, a feeling that began quietly, often in your late 20s or early 30s, that something about your life path was off. You were doing what you were supposed to do, but it did not feel like enough. You told yourself it was normal, that everyone feels this way, that you just needed to work harder, achieve more, reach the next milestone, and so you pushed the feeling down and kept going. Then came the body. Chronic fatigue that rest did not fix. Digestive issues that appeared without clear cause. Tension that lived in your shoulders, your jaw, your lower back. Insomnia that seemed to have no origin. These were not random, they were messages. Your body was trying to tell you that the life you were living was out of alignment with your deeper truth. But instead of listening, you went to doctors who gave you diagnoses without asking about your life. You took medication. You tried to manage the symptoms without addressing the source. For some, the signal came through relationships. Partnerships that looked good on paper but felt empty in practice. Friendships that once mattered but slowly became obligatory. Family dynamics that you participated in out of duty rather than genuine connection. You noticed the hollowness, but you did not know what to do with it. So you blamed yourself. You wondered if you were incapable of intimacy, if something was wrong with your ability to connect. What you did not see was that the relationships were not the problem. The problem was that you were trying to connect from a false self, a version of you that had been constructed to please others rather than express your truth. Then there were the moments of collapse, the job you lost unexpectedly, the relationship that ended without warning, the plan that fell apart despite your best efforts. These were not punishments. They were course corrections. Your psyche was trying to move you off a path that was leading nowhere, but you interpreted the disruption as failure. You scrambled to rebuild what was taken, to get back on track, to prove that you could still make it work. And in doing so, you missed the opportunity to ask whether the track itself was worth being on. Jung understood that the psyche will create a crisis when a person refuses to change voluntarily. It is not cruel, it is protective. It would rather you experience a manageable breakdown now than a complete collapse later. But most people do not see it that way in the moment. They see loss, failure, bad luck. They fight to return to normal, and they succeed for a while. Until the next signal comes, often louder than the one before. There were also the dreams, strange, vivid, recurring images that you woke from with a sense of urgency you could not name. Houses with rooms you did not know existed. Journeys where you were trying to reach a destination but kept getting lost. Figures who felt significant but whose identities you could not place. These were not random firings of neurons. They were communications from the unconscious, showing you what was happening beneath the surface of your waking life, but you did not have the tools to decode them. So you dismissed them as meaningless and forgot them by afternoon. Perhaps the most overlooked signal was the pull towards certain things that made no logical sense. Books that grabbed your attention for reasons you could not explain. Conversations that stayed with you long after they ended. Places that felt inexplicably important. Creative urges that had no practical application. These were breadcrumbs, signs pointing toward what your soul was actually interested in. But you did not follow them. You told yourself they were distractions, that you needed to focus on what mattered, on what was realistic, on what would lead somewhere. Looking back now, you can probably see the pattern. All of these signals were saying the same thing. You were living from the outside in rather than the inside out. You were prioritizing what looked right over what felt true. You were following a map that someone else drew, and your psyche was trying to tell you that the map did not lead where you actually wanted to go. But you could not hear it, or you heard it and chose not to listen, because listening would have meant changing, and changing would have meant uncertainty. Jung said that what you resist persists. The signals do not go away just because you ignore them. They accumulate, they intensify, and eventually they force a confrontation. Many of you are at that point now. The restlessness has become unbearable. The body is breaking down in ways that cannot be ignored. The relationships are either transforming or ending. The career that once felt stable now feels like a trap. The signals are no longer whispers, they are demands. And you can no longer pretend you do not hear them. The question now is not whether you will listen. The question is what you will do with what you hear. Because once you acknowledge that your psyche has been trying to redirect you, once you see the pattern of signals you have been ignoring, you cannot unsee it. You are at a point of no return, and the only way forward is through the very thing you have been avoiding, the inner work, the reckoning, the choice to finally live from a place of truth rather than performance. Understanding why you were born into this generation, recognizing the wound you carry, acknowledging the gifts you were given, seeing the crossroads you now stand at, and finally hearing the signals your soul has been sending. All of this leads to a single question. What now? What does it actually mean to fulfill the mission you were born to carry? Jung was practical about this. He did not believe in grand gestures or dramatic transformations that happen overnight. He believed in daily choices, small acts of integrity that accumulate over time. The work is not spectacular, it is steady. The first step is the hardest because it requires something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You must stop lying to yourself. This sounds simple, but it is not. You have been lying for so long that you no longer recognize it as lying. You tell yourself you are fine when you are not. You say you want things you do not actually want. You agree to situations that harm you because disagreeing feels too risky. You perform enthusiasm for a life that bores you. You pretend your relationships are deeper than they are. You act like your work matters when it does not. These are not malicious lies. They are survival strategies. But they are still lies, and they are killing you slowly. Jung called this process making the unconscious conscious. It means bringing into the light everything you have been hiding, even from yourself, your resentments, your grief, your anger, your disappointment, the dreams you gave up, the parts of yourself you buried to be acceptable, the truth about what you actually feel versus what you think you should feel. This is not comfortable work. It will make you look at things you have spent years avoiding, but it is the only way through. Because you cannot heal what you will not acknowledge, and you cannot change what you refuse to see. Once you stop lying to yourself, the second step becomes possible. You must begin to live in alignment with what you know to be true, even when it costs you. This is where most people falter. They see the truth, they feel it, they acknowledge it, but then they continue living as if they did not. Because living in alignment often means disappointing people, losing relationships, changing careers, walking away from security, making choices that others will not understand. It means becoming visible in ways you have avoided. It means standing alone when you used to blend in. It means trusting your inner knowing more than external validation, and that is terrifying. But here is what Jung understood. The terror you feel when imagining a life of integrity is not as destructive as the slow death you experience when you betray yourself daily. Living out of alignment creates a kind of existential despair that no amount of external success can relieve. You can have everything the world says you should want and still feel empty. Because the emptiness is not about what you have, it is about who you are being. And if who you are being is a performance designed to keep others comfortable, then no achievement will ever satisfy the hunger of your soul. The third step is learning to hold space for others to do the same work without trying to fix or save them. This is particularly important for your generation because you are relational. You were raised to care about what others think, to prioritize harmony, to avoid conflict. And now you are being asked to do inner work that will naturally disrupt the people around you. When you stop pretending, it forces others to confront their own pretending. When you start living in alignment, it highlights where they are still living in compromise. This will create friction. People will be uncomfortable. Some will try to pull you back into old patterns. Others will simply leave. Your job is not to convince them. Your job is not to make them understand. Your job is to do your work and allow them the space to do theirs or not. Jung knew that you cannot awaken someone who is not ready. You can only live your life in a way that makes awakening possible for those who are. This means being honest without being preachy, living differently without judging those who do not, holding your ground without needing to prove you are right. It is a delicate balance between staying true to yourself and remaining connected to others, but it is possible, and it is necessary. The fourth step is finding the others. You are not meant to do this work alone. One of the dangers of individuation is isolation. You go so deep into your own process that you lose connection with people entirely. Jung warned against this. He said that the goal of individuation is not to become separate, but to become whole enough to truly connect. And true connection requires finding people who are also doing the work, not people who validate your old patterns, not people who enable your avoidance, but people who see you, who challenge you, who hold you accountable to your own truth. These people are not always easy to find. They will not necessarily be in your existing circles. You may have to seek them out intentionally, through communities that value depth, through practices that require honesty, through spaces where people gather not to perform, but to be real. When you find them, you will know. There will be a quality of recognition, a sense that you can speak freely without having to explain yourself, a feeling that you are not alone in this strange, difficult, necessary work. These connections are rare, but they are essential, because the path of integrity is hard enough without having to walk it in complete isolation. The final step is perhaps the most important. You must accept that you will not see the results of this work in your lifetime. The healing you are doing is not just for you. It is for the generations that come after. The choices you make now, the patterns you break, the truth you speak, the life you live in alignment. All of it creates a subtle shift in the collective field. It makes it easier for the next person to do the same. It weakens the grip of the old patterns. It models what is possible. But you will not get to see the full impact. You are planting seeds in soil you will not harvest from, and you must make peace with that. Jung understood this. He knew that cultural transformation takes generations, that the work of one lifetime is only a small piece of a much larger picture, and he encouraged people to do the work anyway, not because it would make them famous or successful or even happy in a conventional sense, but because it was their work, because they were the ones alive at this moment, because someone had to go first, and if not them, then who? If not now, then when? Your generation was born to ask these questions, and to live the answers, whatever they may be.